Blink. Blink again. A grey shape flew past me, heading towards the shore, and I caught sight of a pair of eyes. It was the raven, returning from its hunt. The raven was my father. I had never seen him before, and now I would never see him again. My father. The father of all of us, except for the mother of us, the one who lay there in the water, her face pressed against the side of the boat, the side of my father. "I'm sorry," she said, over and over again. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry." The boat began to sink. The water rose up to my neck and my head began to slip below the surface, and it was cold, but it was better than looking at my mother. I tried not to look at my mother, but I couldn't help myself because I had to see her. I was looking out across the sea, and there she was, her face pressed against the side of the boat, looking out across the sea. Her eyes were open, and I saw tears running down her face. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm sorry." She was crying. She was crying. Blink. Blink again. A raven was flying towards me, wings spread wide, flying fast. I saw its beak, and I heard the sound it made, a cry that was part shout and part scream, a sound that made the air vibrate, a sound that stopped time for an instant. Then I saw my father's beak, and he was coming towards me. "I'm sorry," he cried. "I'm sorry." He was flying past me, past the boat and past my mother, but she didn't see him. She didn't see him. Blink. Blink again. I was back at the river, standing on the bank. There were a number of dead fish floating in the water. The sun was up above the trees, and birds were singing. Blink. Blink again. I was on the other side of the river, looking at the dead fish. I ran down to the water's edge and saw a large fish floating just beneath the surface. The fish looked as if it had been dead for some time, and it was beginning to stink. But I was hungry, and I took it out of the water and ate it anyway. And then I started to sing, and then I started to dance. And then I began to laugh. I woke up with a start, my body trembling. For a moment I didn't know where I was. The room was dark, except for a small square of moonlight at the window, and I could hear the sounds of insects and frogs from outside. I tried to remember what had happened in the dream, but it was like trying to remember something you have dreamt. I tried to remember the words that I had spoken in the dream, but all that came back to me were snatches of song. I got up and put on my shoes and left my cabin. It was a clear night, and a thin crescent moon shone high in the sky. The air was warm, and the sky was filled with stars. I went out onto the deck and stood by the railing for a long time, looking out across the dark waters of the river. The sounds of the jungle were very far away, and everything was still and silent. I felt a sense of peace that I had rarely known. I thought of my father again, but this time I remembered the words he had said to me. I remembered that he had called me son, and I remembered his eyes when he had looked at me, his eyes that seemed to see inside me and know me as no other living thing could know me. I looked at the moon. There were 3 moons that night, the small one rising in the east, and the large one high overhead in the west. But it was the moon that rose at dusk that held my gaze. It was almost full, its round disk surrounded by a halo of light, its surface pitted by shadows of trees and clouds and waves. And then I knew that I wanted to go to sleep again, that I wanted to return to the dream and to my father. I turned and went back down the steps to my cabin and lay down on my bed and closed my eyes again. And once more I was there beside the river, my father beside me. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm sorry." And then I knew that it was over, and that I would never see him again, that there would never be another chance to say goodbye. And then I opened my eyes. I sat up in my bed and looked around my cabin, at the table and chair and desk, and at the bed next to me, and the little bookshelf and the lantern on the wall. The lantern was still lit, and beside it there was a small glass bottle filled with oil, its wick burning low. And in my hand was a book of matches, which I had taken from my pocket before going to sleep. The match burned my fingers. It burned my fingers and made a tiny sputter of light in the darkness of my cabin. And then there was a larger flame, and I touched the match to the wick of the lantern. It lit with a loud pop, and I could see again, though it was still dark outside my cabin. The night was bright with moonlight. I left my cabin and went down the steps to the deck, my heart beating fast with excitement, my body trembling as though from an enormous weight that had been lifted from me. It was time to leave now, while I still had time. There was no telling when we might get to the city again or if we would be able to find our way home again from there. We might not even make it to the city. If there were any more trouble along the river, we might have to abandon the boat and make our way through the jungle on foot. But it didn't matter anymore because I had found it. I had found what I had come for. I had opened the cabin door and stepped outside into the night. I went down to the rear of the boat and opened the doors at the back of the deck house, letting in a breeze that carried with it the smell of rain and leaves and earth and flowers. It smelled so rich and alive that it made me want to cry. So strong was the desire in me to stay here forever and never return to that cold room in the cold city in that cold country far away in a faraway country where everything was dark and cold. I closed the doors again and went down to the lower deck where my father's cabin was. The doors were closed, but I didn't need them to tell me which one was his. The one that had been mine had been empty ever since we left home, and it still looked empty. The key was still in its place beside the door, but it didn't matter anymore because I had found what I wanted. I walked slowly down the aisle of the lower deck and stopped outside his door, looking at the key that hung from a piece of string beside it. There was a faint glow inside his room from a nightlight, but no other lights were on and there was no sound. I went down to the next door, which was open, and looked inside. There were clothes hanging from hooks on the wall, some of them mine and some of them my mother's. The room had been cleaned up after her death, and the stains of blood on the floor had been scrubbed away. There were more clothes on a chair, and a few pieces of furniture that looked like they had come from my mother's house. A mirror, some shelves holding knickknacks, a clock on one of the walls. But there was no other sign that anyone had lived there since she died. The room smelled of fish and sweat and blood, and I almost turned around and went back upstairs again, but then I heard my father's voice say my name. I stopped at the doorway and listened. Billy? It was a strange voice, high-pitched and wavering, almost like a child's voice or a woman's voice, but not quite either one of them, and it seemed to be coming from the floor below me where no voices should be coming from. Billy, are you there? I could hear my father moving about, making a sound as though he were going down into his room, but he wasn't moving very quickly. I had time to run back up the stairs and hide in my cabin before he came into the hallway. Billy, are you there? Please come out! He was shouting now, shouting for me to come out of my room and bring him something to drink. It was like a game that we used to play, shouting for one another from our rooms late at night when no one else was around, pretending that we were lost and frightened in the woods, calling out for each other in a voice that sounded as if we were children who were being punished by adults for something we had done wrong. I looked down the corridor in both directions and saw no one there, but it was hard to be sure of anything in the darkness. My eyes were not yet fully accustomed to the light from the nightlight inside my father's room, and it seemed darker than it should have been, as though someone had covered my father's nightlight with a black cloth so that it would be easier for him to sleep. I could feel myself beginning to shake with fear. I moved back into my cabin, closing the door behind me, and I sat on my bed. My father didn't know where I was, but if he looked inside my cabin, he would see me sitting there with a match in my hand, lighting his lamp so that he could read in his room. He wouldn't know what it meant if he saw me sitting there with a book of matches in my hand. He would think I had come to rob his cabin of the food that he had saved for me, or something like that. And he would be angry with me for not taking his lamp when I left my cabin earlier that evening. I lit the match and touched it to the wick of his lamp and then quickly closed my eyes as I heard him cry out in alarm and start running towards my cabin. It was all over now. There was nothing more to worry about, nothing more to fear or be afraid of. It was time for me to leave the boat and go out into the forest with my mother's knife in my pocket. Time to leave her behind forever. The match burned my fingers, but I held it there until it was gone, until there was nothing left but a tiny wisp of smoke hanging in the air above the wick of the lamp, until there was nothing left but the smell of burnt wick and oil.